why everybody is a teeny bit pagan. Part 1. What is a pagan? So far, we've only been talking about living religions. Religions with a sizable number of followers who are active today. But what about dead religions? Do religions just go extinct? In a certain sense, yes they do. But even when people convert to a new religion, they never just entirely shuck off that old religion. They can't. Sure, you can have a very different worldview than that of your ancestors, but religion is a lot more than just your thoughts. It's intertwined with your culture, your language, your arts, your morality, and even your logic. So, even after a religion seems to disappear, aspects of it linger on in many other, more subtle forms. Now, we're going to get ready to discuss the most influential religions of West Asia and Europe: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But all of those religions grew up in other religious environments. They replaced older religions. And they didn't just replace them overnight either. The religion or religions that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam replaced are referred to collectively as paganism. But what is paganism? Well, first, we have to note that this tradition ends in an ism. That should tip us off to something. When you see a worldview that ends in an ism, it's important to remember that this is a modern Western invention. There's no ancient word that means paganism, not exactly. Paganism is what modern people called the pre-Jewish, pre-Christian, and pre-Islamic religions of the Middle East, Europe, and North Africa. And like the word Hinduism, meaning Indiaism, paganism is a catch-all. It's a simple label designed to contain a vast number of traditions and peoples over the millennia, and those people weren't always related to each other in any meaningful way. The word pagan itself kind of gives the game away. While paganism is a modern term, pagan is quite ancient. Pagan as a label was first used by Christians in either the 3rd or 4th centuries of the Christian calendar. Paganus, plural pagani, is Latin for a yokel or a country bumpkin. It's like the pejorative English word redneck or hick. It's a demeaning way of referring to someone who is uncultured, uneducated, and lives somewhere remote. Pagan is an insult. When Christianity started to become popular and politically powerful, they started to refer to non-Christians as pagans, meaning people who were backwards or stupid. No one in the ancient world, though, would have called themselves a pagan. Likewise, the first Muslims in the 7th century called these people mushriks, plural mushrikun. This is an Arabic word meaning an associator, someone who associates. It means they falsely associate human or natural things with God. They incorrectly thought stones or animals were gods. Therefore, they made bad associations between natural phenomena and supernatural things. And again, no one would have called themselves a mushrik, an associator. Like Paganus, mushrik was an insult. A little bit earlier, Hebrew-speaking Jews called these people the goyim, the nations, or just the peoples. It functionally means what people in other countries, other nations do or believe. And when most Jews started to speak Greek, they translated goyim into the Greek word ethnos, the people, or gens, Greek for the nations. This is the root of the English word ethnic, meaning a group of people, usually meaning people not like yourself. And also the word Gentile, just meaning a non-Jew. Now, Gentile or Goyim aren't necessarily as explicitly insulting as the Christian word paganus or the Muslim word mushrik, but they still carried a very negative connotation. It's kind of like referring to everyone as the foreigners. It highlights that they're not like you at all. And once again, no one would have thought of themselves that way. Here's just one example of how this works from the Gospel of Matthew, written in Greek in the 1st century for a Jewish and/or Christian audience. And when you pray, do not keep babbling on like pagans. In English translation, this seems to be talking about religion, which in a sense it is. But the original Greek audience would have read it much more generally, because it says, when you pray, do not keep babbling on like ethnikoi, the people of other countries, the Gentiles. It isn't just talking about what people believe, like the word religion or paganism would suggest, but it's more about what they do. They babble on in strange foreign languages. They talk too much, thinking to impress with their words. They think their words have magical powers, but they're really just talking funny. Alright, so then what did these supposed pagans call themselves? Well, the short answer is nothing at all. There's no word that ancient people used for themselves that works anything like the word pagan. There's no thought or label that binds together all of the different religious phenomena of Ireland, Britain, Northern Europe, Greece, Rome, North Africa, Egypt, Arabia, the Near East, Iberia, and Asia Minor. And as we now know, there isn't even an ancient thought like religion anyway. These people had no way of talking about their systems of belief, morals, and practices that would line up with religion or with the word paganism. Alright, so what's the long answer? Well, since there's no notion like religion in the ancient world, those customs, mores, and thoughts that we would call religion would be expressed in lots of other ways. Most of it would have to do with your ethnic group. Now, like the word religion, there's no ancient thought like race either. Race is a modern way of categorizing people, just like religion is. And just in case you were wondering, just because ancient people didn't have our notion of race, and therefore our notion of racism, that doesn't mean they didn't have plenty of other kinds of prejudice and bigotry. No, ancients only had ethnicity, a particular combination of language, ancestry, and lifestyle. This comes from the Greek ethnos, which we just met as a Jewish way of talking about other people's cultures. Usually, ethnos, ethnic information, would explain what we today would call religion. Say, for example, you were in the 1st century of the Christian calendar somewhere in the Middle East, and you met someone from Athens. This person would probably call herself a Greek. Now, in the ancient world, there was no country called Greece like there is today. So what she meant was, if she was Greek, she was a member of the Greek culture. She spoke the Greek language, her ancestors were Greeks, and she wore her clothes in Greek fashion. And, therefore, you would also safely assume she worshipped Greek gods. There was no need for a word like Greek religion, because the word Greek was enough. Greeks do Greek things, like wear their hair up, eat lamb, read Homer, and worship Zeus. These thoughts all went together. And you could do the same thing for someone who was Roman, or British, or Egyptian, or Arabian. Your ethnicity included within it the thoughts that we would call religion. And there were also hometowns. A particular city or village would have a patron god or patron gods, and it would be assumed that if you were from that city, you worshipped those gods. So, in the case of this Greek woman we met from Athens, you could pretty safely guess that she was a member of the cult of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. By the way, this is also why the English word culture comes from the same Latin root as the word cult. To be part of a culture implied you were part of a cult. Now, it isn't always a simple one-to-one correspondence between someone's religious activities and their culture. The ancient world was diverse, just like today, and plenty of forms of paganism thrived outside of their original homelands. But, usually, ancient people would explain their religious identities by just saying where they were from. That was enough. Part 2. The gods and their descendants. We've been talking a lot about gods, but maybe it's time to ask what a god means precisely. Not everyone's gods were the same and worked the same way. But on the whole, the gods of paganism, that is, the pre-Christian and pre-Islamic peoples of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, were much more eminent than transcendent. The gods were just like us, only more powerful, knowledgeable, and longer living. The gods usually had forms. They dwelt in particular places rather than other places, and they had minds that worked roughly like human minds. Now, a very important thing to remember about paganism is that most of the gods were local. They had very specific jurisdictions. They lived in particular places and only had power there, with some notable exceptions, but we'll meet those next time. This is why most pagans would be called polytheists, believers in many gods. You would have a god of your town, another god of the nearby forest, another god of the port and the river, and yet another god of the sky over your head. And typically, the more gods you had, the less you thought each god actually did. So the gods fell into various forms of hierarchies. A god of your kitchen would be less powerful than the god of your city, and the god of your city would be less powerful than the god of a mountain, and a mountain god would be even less powerful than the god of the sky or the sun. Now, polytheism is actually a very useful way of explaining the world around you. There's all sorts of natural and human forces, which sometimes work together but sometimes clash with each other. And so it's easy to explain why things don't always go well if the gods of all these forces had different agendas. Not every pagan was a polytheist, though. Many people would have been henotheists. Henotheism is reverence for only one particular god out of many. So a henotheist would actually believe that many gods existed, but they would only be concerned with one. You just worry about your local god, and who cares what the gods of the village over there are doing? Those aren't your gods. And then there were pagans who were monotheists too. They only believed in one god. If you asked them about other gods, they would either deny that they exist, or say they don't know, or just say that their one god has many forms and manifestations. So whatever they worshipped on the other side of the sea over there, that was just your god with a different name. So, what kind of gods do we find in the pagan world? Well, all kinds. But there were some common trends. The most universal, and probably the oldest, were fertility gods, gods of sexuality, reproduction, and agriculture. Some examples would be goddesses like Ishtar in Mesopotamia, Isis in Egypt, Al-Usa in Arabia, Aphrodite in Greece, and Venus in Rome. Goddesses like these, and there are many, many more of them, are so common because they dealt with very universal concerns, the need for food and reproduction. Every people everywhere need to eat, and they need to have sex. So it isn't surprising that nearly everywhere you go in the pagan world, you find these sexualized mother goddesses. And if you recall the Harappan civilization in ancient India, we saw fertility goddesses there too. That's not a coincidence. On a related note, sky and weather gods tended to be quite standard as well. If food and reproduction are particularly important to you, rain and clouds are too. And like food and sex, the sky is everywhere in every culture. Because what happens in the sky relates directly to food production and therefore human fertility, sky gods usually have some kind of relationship to fertility goddesses. They could be married, for instance, as in the case of the Greek sky god Zeus. He's wedded to Hera, the goddess of marriage and motherhood. Or the sky god could be the fertility goddess, as in the instance of the Celtic goddess Brigid. She was at once the goddess of the weather, but also a goddess of reproduction. The Egyptian goddess Nut, the sky, is usually depicted as a naked woman arched over the world, and her children that she produces are the gods of the earth over which she stands. Elemental gods, too, tended to be quite standard on the whole. Water and earth gods are found almost everywhere in the pagan world. Some famous examples include the Mesopotamian Tiamat, who is salt water, the ocean, and Apsu, fresh water. In the Greek religions, there is Gaia, the earth, and her mate, Oranos, the heavens. Now, these sorts of elemental gods are usually not actively worshipped in the same way as fertility and sky gods, but rather they exist more as stories of how the material world around us works or came into being. Another universal human phenomenon is death. And so therefore we see gods of death and the underworld everywhere. Some famous examples of this are the jackal-headed Anubis in Egypt, the god of mummification, right? The god who cares for corpses. He's the one who takes care of dead bodies. He escorts souls into the underworld in order to stand trial for their deeds in life. In Greek, there is Hades, who is both the god of the underworld, the god of the dead, and the name of the underworld over which he reigns. And also in Greece is Hermes, the messenger of the gods. He would ferry people down to Hades after they died. How about some less common gods? Most of the interactions pagans had with their gods would involve very local supernatural beings, the gods of a given town, of a home, or the gods of one's own family. So, for instance, the Romans were especially interested in ancestral cults, where one paid services to one's own dead family members. And certain people, usually aristocrats, would claim to be directly related to famous or powerful gods. And there were rather personal gods too. In Latin, one of these gods who is especially present with one specific individual is called a genius, hence our English word for someone who has particular gifts. Genius was also loaned into Arabic as jinn, a supernatural being that dwells in a certain place or with a certain object, like a stone or a tree. These geniuses and jinn could harm people, or help people, or possess people, giving them strange knowledge and bizarre speech. Many people in the Middle East today, and elsewhere, still believe in these jinn, who meddle in human affairs, sometimes helpfully, sometimes mischievously, and sometimes cruelly. By the way, this is also where we get the Western notion of a genie, a powerful spirit of a lamp or a ring. In Greek, these sorts of gods were called daemons. So, for instance, when the famous philosopher Socrates was asked why he taught people his teachings, even though they tended to stir up trouble, Socrates just naturally explained that he had a certain personal daemon who made him do it. Personal gods were especially notable in political figures like Roman emperors and Egyptian pharaohs. And if you think about it, It makes good political sense to think and claim that your power over nations was directly linked to the will of a god who was looking out for you personally. And there are also half-gods, or demigods, beings with some human ancestry and also some divine ancestry. This could mean that a certain male god impregnated a human woman, and this was the case with many famous heroes. Heracles was such a case. Because he was born with a human mother, but his father was the sky god Zeus, he had supernatural strength and would eventually become a god himself. And there were also cases of demigods whose mothers were goddesses and whose fathers were human. Achilles, the hero of Homer's Iliad, was born this way. His mother was the nymph Thetis. A nymph is a forest goddess, while his father was just a mortal man. And some people had gods and humans all over their families. So in Mesopotamia, the hero Gilgamesh was like this. We're told that he was 2/3 a god and 1/3 a human. Well, that kind of genetics makes for very complicated math, but it's just another way of saying he had a number of human and divine ancestors in his family. And vice versa, humans could get promoted to god status. For example, Gilgamesh, who we just met, seems to have been an actual historical king in the city of Uruk, in modern Iraq, who lived around 2800 BCE. The Roman Emperor Hadrian had a lover named Antinous. When Antinous died, Hadrian had him promoted to a god, and there were cults to Antinous all across the Roman Empire. And this leads us to an important point about paganism. The gods are close by. They're immediate. There are gods in people's families, and indeed some gods who were people. There are gods in your town, in your fireplace, in your well, in a nearby river, in the mountains. There isn't some sort of clear break between gods and humans. It's much more like a continuum. There was no clearly divine world distinct from a clearly human world. They were all mixed up. And so people experienced their gods all the time in their world, in their communities, and even in themselves. Part 3. When in Rome. So, how did all these different forms of paganism, personal, local, regional, and national, how did they relate to each other? If you were a Greek who traveled to Egypt, what did you think of the god that you might have seen there? Well, it depends. On the whole, you would think, just one more god on the pile. If you believed in many gods, and most of them only had power and cults in particular places, well, then foreign gods were just the gods of other people and other places. And you could, without any issue, participate in the cults of those gods. So, no one would think anything if you were a Greek member of the cult of Athena, traveling to Egypt, actively participating in the Egyptian cults of gods like Anubis, and then you would just go home and return to your old ancestral cult of Athena again. In fact, many ancient pagans would purposefully travel to go check out a particularly famous or influential cult or temple. It was like religious tourism. And sometimes, people would really like these foreign gods. Like, really like them. Maybe even more than the gods they grew up with. So, hey, your god works really well. Can I borrow it? This is why we see evidence of the worship of some gods all over the place. For example, in Roman England, there was a cult to the Egyptian goddess Isis in the village of Londinium. That is, London. In London, there were people worshipping an Egyptian fertility goddess. Well, didn't the Roman English have their own fertility goddesses? Well, yeah, sure. But Egypt was the major breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Egypt made food particularly well. And so, if Egypt was so fertile, it stands to reason that their fertility goddess works really well. Likewise, if you go to the ruins of the 1st century city of Pompeii, which was famously destroyed and therefore preserved by a volcanic eruption in the year 79 of the Christian era, there you're going to see evidence of Isis worship too, in Italy. And even more, we can see another fertility goddess, this one whose name we don't know. This statue is not Italian, it's Indian. This is a Hindu goddess. Some ancient Roman went all the way to India for something or other, found a really useful fertility goddess, and brought her back home with him. And in other times, the people didn't need to borrow the foreign gods at all. They would just naturally conclude that their gods are the same as these foreign gods, just with different names. This is what happened when the Romans conquered the Greek mainland in 146 before the Christian calendar began. Even though the Romans had won the war, they would associate their gods with the Greek gods so much that their religions kind of merged together. The Greek demigod Heracles became Hercules in Latin. Aphrodite became the Roman Venus. The Greek Zeus was the Roman Jupiter. And if you were in the Middle East, the Greek Zeus and the Roman Jupiter would be the Canaanite Baal. Baal, Zeus, Jupiter, they were all the same stuff apparently. Well, this happened so much that sometimes even gods would fuse together. The Egyptians, for instance, had Anubis, who guarded people on their way into the Egyptian version of the underworld. And the Greeks had Hermes, who did something similar. People died, and he would ferry them to the underworld. So, eventually, you had Hermanubis, a single form of both gods. Now, it isn't that people didn't know that Hermes and Anubis were worshipped separately. It's just that it didn't matter. Your local gods and my local gods were the same. We just call them different things. This made the pagan world of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa very pluralistic on the whole. Cultures and religions would blend together and move around, and for the most part, no one really cared. Actually, it was usually kind of encouraged. But not always. Occasionally, there were gods who did not play well with others. There were gods and their humans who were actively antagonistic to rival gods and foreign people, and so they would try to suppress those gods. And this even happened on the local level. If one particular local god was favored by a ruler or a powerful family, other local gods could have their cults shut down, or have their images destroyed, or have their names cursed. But we'll get more into that next time. Some questions for you. What is a pagan? What does pagan refer to? How do pagan gods work? What kind of pagan gods are there? How do different forms of paganism relate to each other?